So good morning. Another lovely morning in the Lake District. A little bit wet this morning, but we have come to Riddle Falls, I think it is. And we have this beautiful waterfall you can just see down behind me here. So I thought what actually might be really useful is to do a video on, I guess, a few tips or a few helpful suggestions of how to shoot waterfalls, and maybe kind of just talk you through my process of what I would normally do, how I would shoot them, and when I think the best time to shoot them is. I guess our plan today ideally wouldn't have been probably coming here. We had hoped to maybe get a really lovely sunrise and hopefully get some lovely light, but the weather is turned really grey and really dull, really overcast, so it is the perfect time to be shooting waterfalls. So I guess the first thing I would say is I usually try and plan waterfall shoots around dull and overcast days, because the light's so much more flat, and it means that whenever you're trying to get your exposure, it's so much easier, because obviously you're trying to shoot the white water of the waterfall and also exposed for the black rocks as well. Normally that can be quite tricky, especially if you throw a lot of direct sunlight into the mix. So normally flat dull days are a little bit easier to get your exposure sorted. And there's a little old stone building down here in our frame, and if I just show you this here, so you can see down there quite a lot of tourists and walkers and stuff just kind of popping in to see the view and stuff, and most of them obviously are wearing bright red or bright blue coats, so we're just waiting on them moving along, and then we will try and get our first shot. Going to talk you through the composition here at the minute. So over here we have we've got some more people just walked in the frame. Anyway, so we have the house over here, which is on the left hand side, and then the falls are over here, and there's another little set of, I guess it's just white water, which whenever we start to use a long exposure is going to create a nice blurry effect. So I think from up here this is probably going to be the composition I'm going to shoot once those people disappear. But then we'll go down to this area here, actually down to the water level, and try and shoot up it just to get a slightly different perspective. My exposure time at the minute, I'm going to be around about half a second at f11. I've only got a polarizer on, and I'm not going to use any MDs or anything, because I quite like the effect that half a second exposure is having. So we'll just take this away and we'll just do a shot. Check everything is nice and sharp. Yeah, looking good so far. I've actually come down to the bottom of the river now. I tried to get down lower on that last waterfall shot, but it just wasn't happening. I think there's just so much water in it. The kind of the water levels are quite high, so there may be another way down, I'm not sure, I may try it in a minute or two, but we've actually come down on the opposite side of the bridge. So we were standing up there before, and we've come down and we're shooting this section here, and there's this amazing green, it's like a mossy stone wall, and because it's such a dull day, the colours are just so vibrant. The greens are really popping out, especially as you rotate the polarizer. So that's one of the tips I want to give, is when you're shooting waterfalls, is I will always use a polarizing filter 100% of the time. The polarizer will cut through the glare, so you're aiming to kind of reduce the amount of contrast between the water and normally the rocks or whatever that are around it. So using the polarizer just cuts through the glare. It'll help you see under the water as well, if that's possible. So it cuts out all the reflections. It makes the water really dark, and then anywhere that there's white water, it'll help to make that really stand out. And obviously it helps the colours. It gives them a nice saturation boost as well. And whenever I'm actually, oh hang on, it is still raining here. Whenever I'm actually taking my exposure, so there's a couple of ways of doing it. I'll always try and expose for the highlights. So you do not want to get back and bring the images into Lightroom and find that your highlights are completely blown in the water. One, you'll be really frustrated, and two, it'll look pretty awful. So I will always expose for the highlights. Normally you can recover enough shadow detail. The Sony files, there's an amazing dynamic range with them. So I usually, if I'm exposing for the highlights, I can normally bring back all the details in the shadows. But if you're concerned about it, take another exposure, and then you can blend the two. So expose one for the highlights, and then maybe expose one for the shadows, and then blend the two together afterwards. At least that way you're covering all bases, but you may find you might actually be able to get it all from the one shot. So yeah, normally for me, probably two of the most important things for shooting waterfalls would be using your polarizer and then exposing for your highlights. Now when it comes to shutter speeds for waterfalls, usually I like to use some kind of a long exposure. So anything from maybe half a second up to 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever. But this is the fun part where you kind of play about, and not every waterfall is going to suit the same kind of exposure. So at the moment today, I think I'm shooting at about half a second, and because there's quite a lot of flow down the river and down the waterfalls, half a second seems to be working pretty good, because I don't want to just blur the water too much that there's not actually any detail in it. So half a second is still giving me lots of little, there's a nice blur, but there's lots of little textures and details coming through. Whereas if I was using maybe like a 10-second exposure, that would be more silky and you wouldn't have the same detail. Now the fact that it's really dull today is helping, and that's why I'm only using a polarizer. So that's why I'm able to get such a slow shutter speed without any kind of help or any kind of ND filters. So if I'm struggling, so on a bright day, I would normally use one of these, which is so I use a Format High-Tech, the Firecrest Ultra, and this is one of their ND filters. They come in different strengths. So this one here is a 3-stop, so that's going to cut out the amount of light that's getting into your camera by 3 stops, and that'll help you get a much longer exposure time. So you could use maybe like a 3-stop or a 6-stop. Again, it just depends on how bright the scene is and what kind of effect it is. So I guess another little tip would be just play about with the shutter speeds and try different effects. And even if you have to maybe invest in something like this, like an ND filter, you can get a slightly different effect just by popping one of those in and getting a really long exposure. So I guess for a lot of the settings that I'm using when I'm shooting waterfalls are they're pretty much going to stay the same except for the shutter speed. So I'll be shooting down at a really low ISO, so something probably ISO 50 or ISO 100. Normally maybe in around about f11, so those settings probably won't change an awful lot. What will change will be the shutter speed, and I'll usually just use the ND filters.